Connecticut East This Week is supported by CT Examiner, a multi-award winning online newspaper covering stories from across the state, from politics to business, health, education, and the arts. For just a $20 annual subscription, CT Examiner will let you know what's happening where you live. ctexaminer.com, reporting and supporting what matters. What is neurodivergence and what does it mean for the people who are diagnosed under this umbrella term that covers neurological conditions? We talk to an expert and two people with a neurodivergent diagnosis. Plus, we take a look at other stories making the headlines from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith. You may or may not have heard the term neurodivergence. It's a relatively recent umbrella term that covers a multitude of neurological and developmental conditions like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, to name just three. But what does it mean to have a neurodivergence diagnosis, and how does it affect the lives of people who have one of the conditions? In this week's podcast, I talk with a doctor of psychological sciences to better understand what neurodivergence is and what it covers, and we also talk with two people who both have a neurodivergence diagnosis about how it affects their lives and how they are helping the neurodivergent community in Connecticut with a new comic strip dealing with problem gambling. Dr. Haft, thank you ever so much for joining us. We're talking about neurodivergence and what that means. For many people, it may be a term that they've not heard about in the past. Can you just sort of simply explain, what does neurodivergence mean? What does it cover?
So neurodivergence typically cover individuals who, or a characterization of conditions like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, dyslexia, developmental dyslexia, and often autism spectrum disorders. Historically, it has been decades ago that individuals, advocacy groups with children, often with children with autism or autism spectrum disorders, have used this term neurodiversity. That has become more mainstream over time and have included dyslexia, ADHD. And if you get to the nitty-gritty of it, neurodiversity now is technically covering more of the broader idea that every brain is different, and that then the word neurodivergent has become more of a common term to be used for individuals with ADHD, dyslexia, and autism spectrum.
Neurodivergence is not a disease or a mental illness, but rather a description of a different way of experiencing the world. Would that be a fair assessment?
That is the way people use to characterize the group of people who are usually considered within this group.
So just talk to us about people who may have received a diagnosis that is under the umbrella term of neurodivergence. I know there's a lot of things that you just mentioned individually, which now are sort of under that broader term. But what sort of challenges do some of these individuals face as against neurotypical people?
So it's a vast array of characteristics, as you can imagine. Dyslexia is called dyslexia because they have challenges in learning to read. ADHD is because they're hyperactive or they have those trends and attention issues. And autism have these three big traits in this domains of social and language and others. So it's difficult to describe it in one word, but often when they're younger, it could present itself in different ways. And mostly it becomes most prevalent, except for in severe cases of autism, when they start school. It shows up as being hyperactive and they can't sit still, they're not focused, or they have challenges reading. I think the key idea here under neurodiversity or neurodivergence in particular is that individuals who are characterized and often diagnosed this way have challenges, but they have major strengths. And so the idea is, let's not call them by and characterize them by their challenges. Dyslexia means dyslexia, challenges in reading. Attention deficit deficit, the word is there, hyperactivity disorder. There's two words that are abrasive to some families, and when they have multiple areas of talent. So I think it's a broad word, but it's great to characterize and to let everyone understand that every brain is different. Of course, we all have challenges and we all have strengths. And it becomes particularly important as you go through schooling because there's more social emotional aspects that kick in, and anxiety and depression also, but self-concept and confidence. And probably you think about your background, why you are talented and gifted in this area, and how you're become such an expert in this area is probably because you're focusing on your strength and what you bring to the table and to the world. And this allows this word neurodivergence, and this concept sort of allows people to think and focus on the strength that becomes particularly important as you pass through higher education or compulsory education and go into the workforce.
One of the things, again, I think we should make very clear is that people who are considered neurodivergent often are just as intelligent and sometimes even more intelligent than some neurotypical people. I mean, their actual abilities are just different, but it certainly doesn't mean that they are any less intelligent than anyone, does it?
That is absolutely true. And I'll give you just one example of a colleague of mine that I talk to often. Whenever I have big idea problems and consolidating big picture problems, I will contact my colleague who's an engineering professor at UConn, Arash, and call up my good friend, and he will give me kind of ideas. And he has dyslexia and ADHD, and he's very open about this. And he just won the PCASE award from the White House during the Biden administration that is awarded to people who have the highest honor given to early stage scientists. Jack Horner is another example. He failed college and never graduated because he couldn't read and he struggled, but he won the MacArthur Genius Award, and he was the scientific advisor for most of the Jurassic Park and World movies, and he's made major discoveries. So those are just two salient examples of individuals that are remarkable.
Conversely, as well, unfortunately, some people who are neurodivergent do also have certain challenges. We're talking today specifically about links to problem gambling. Some also can go on to maybe having substance use disorders. Just again, I know I'm asking you to really encapsulate a huge subject into a very few words, but what are some of the things that are happening with people who are neurodivergent, which make them more susceptible to things like possibly problem gambling or maybe substance use disorder?
So there's two ways to think about this, and both are in some ways interrelated. And as neuroscientists like myself, we study the intersection and whether there's a neurobiological link between this. One of the simple ways, and the way most people have historically thought, is if you have challenges in reading, or if you have challenges in other areas like attention, you don't do well in school necessarily, or you have to work really hard to get through school. And you might feel, and that could lead to these mental health issues, including anxiety, depression. Some people end up having these issues that you're talking about. The other way to think about it is that there might be more of a neurobiological link between this more directly. So I don't study the gambling issues necessarily, so I haven't observed it myself. But for example, I was at University of California, San Francisco, going to University of Connecticut. But at that dyslexia center, there was a paper that just came out a couple of years ago talking about risk propensity and how it's heightened in individuals with dyslexia. This was just about dyslexia, but they're showing these cognitive links between those. There's some ideas behind this that there might be a more biological link. We have a hypothesis about links with anxiety, depression, and how they're more vulnerable to stress, and how it might make sense neurobiologically. So while this can't get at causal links, so you don't know, besides the fact that there seems to be an association that's statistically higher than neurotypical individuals, this starts the conversation that it's a chicken or egg story, and you need to consider both.
Is it also, and again, I'm talking very broadly here, because of the way that the brains of people who are considered neurodivergent work, that they associate maybe with patterns, colors, sort of like objects in a way that we don't, that it's something that they have to follow. It becomes like a pattern that they have to follow because that's just how they process things. Does that make sense?
I've heard that more for autism spectrum disorders, but the positive example of that, for example, is that Temple Grandin, there's a old documentary or movie made after her, and I think there's a new one coming out soon also. She has autism spectrum disorders, ASD, and she believes that she has transformed the field of agriculture, how you treat animals humanely and so on. And everyone follows those guidelines, at least in the United States. And she's a strong advocate of autism and how her experience with that or having that brings about these special visual patterns that maybe some other people may not be able to see. So that is very interesting. And so all these aspects, it's a yin or yang, depending on what the society demands and how you make use out of it.
Where are we with learning more about people who are neurodivergent and all of the various different conditions that fall under that? Are we continuing to improve our understanding, or have we plateaued? Where would you say that we're at with that?
So it is progressing. Research is slow. I think historically people have focused on the genetics and the neurobiological aspects of this and figuring out the cause with the hope that we might be able to support individuals who are struggling. We are continuing those efforts in research, but there is an equal emphasis, I would say, on the social emotional aspects and also the strengths and how we can really look at both the strengths and whether it's a chicken or egg. And then also how we can help them go into the workforce, leverage their strength, and really tying basic research all the way to policy and the workforce. I think that's a trend that I see at various centers around the world and country.
Dr. Fumiko Haft, Professor of Psychological Studies at UConn, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.
Joining us on the podcast is Penn Baxter, a student, and Constance Kristofic, a non-profit professional and fundraiser, both of whom have received a diagnosis of a neurodivergent and also collectively have created a comic strip about problem gambling. To you both, welcome. Penn, I want to start with you. Could you just introduce yourself and share with us a little bit about the comic strip called The Odds?
Yeah, of course. So, hi, my name is Penn Baxter. I'm co-creator and illustrator of The Odds, which is a comic about problem gambling among neurodivergent teens and young adults. So, the main purpose of The Odds was to create problem gambling messaging for teens and young adults on the spectrum, because Connie and I have noticed that typical problem gambling messaging is usually catered to like neurotypical people. And because of that perspective, it doesn't sound faithful to the way neurodivergents speak in real life. So we thought that with our comic, The Odds, we could speak to people in the neurodivergent community and just create something that's as clear, direct, and relatable to them as possible.
Constance, the same question to you. Just introduce yourself a little bit and also share with us how you got involved with The Odds as well.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so I have been in the nonprofit field. I'm a Gen Xer in the nonprofit field for about 20 years, mostly doing development work professionally, but then I do a lot of community work, more of a queer activist. But then I started shifting to creative projects. And through an amateur film project I did, I met Penn through a film festival in Connecticut where he was volunteering. And then since then, we collaborated on this art project. And for me, more newly diagnosed, I've been more learning out of this and making new connections.
So Penn, tell us what led you to get involved in The Odds.
Well, it all started when I received a grant from the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, DMHAS, and they wanted someone to create a comic that talks about problem gambling and like the different effects it has, because specifically we're living in a time where like problem gambling and sports betting is being like heavily promoted, and they wanted to create messaging that not only speaks out to neurotypical people but also neurodivergent people, because when it comes to them developing problem gambling issues, the problems associated with them can be quite different. For example, like I don't have a gambling problem right now, but that doesn't mean I couldn't develop one like in the future. For neurodivergence, it can sneak up without us even realizing it. So the main purpose of the odds was to spread like as much education and awareness of this problem as much as we can.
And Constance, again, what got you involved in this pioneering project?
Yeah, so I share that I don't particularly have a gambling problem at present, but I really related to the behavioral addiction as someone, who, has a history of whether it's overeating, overspending, overthinking, being on the internet obsessively. I have that behavior and I see I am vulnerable to any type of addiction. So working on this project has been wonderful.
And Pen, explain to us, if you would, some unique challenges the neurodivergent community faces regarding problem gambling.
One challenge is that neurodivergent people can often encounter difficulties understanding sarcasm or subtle social cues in comics. People in the neurodivergent community who don't always get the joke right away. One of our primary purposes in creating the odds was making sure that the dialogue was very straightforward and very matter of fact, meaning that the characters say what they mean and mean what they say. So the good thing is that the odds uses language that sounds natural to Connie and me, which was the goal. So if we thought the delivery felt comfortable, then maybe we could use that as a comic.
And also, Pen, tell me, how does the odds approach building trust and a connection with the neurodivergent community?
Primary approach is establishing a sense of relatability with the characters in the comics and the people who read them. So, for example, when we were analyzing our community feedback, we noticed how people have already taken ownership of the odds, being that they see themselves in the comics they're reading. For example, I saw one user who was reading the comic and they said, "This is life," which is like, I never thought we would like actually represent like certain people that faithfully. And that was really amazing to be a part of that experience.
And also tell me, what is something that you have learned from the neurodivergent community through this project?
I suppose I've learned that it's very important to reach out to the community as much as possible to see if we're faithfully representing their voices, because as long as we're like catering to them as faithfully as possible, then I think that means we're doing a decent enough job.
And Constance, just add in on that, because I'm sure you've probably got something that you've learned as well from this.
Yeah, so some of the message boards or communication we had, one thing I noticed, and also perhaps because I'm in a different generation, was that parents or professionals were seeing, their clients or their children or younger relatives in the stories. So it was educational and informative to them about media literacy and things like that, as well as the local resources in Connecticut that we found, such as Smart Recovery Connecticut that has youth meetings in person and online, and the Connection that has its own library for addiction as well.
And Pen, tell me, what is one thing individuals can do better to support the neurodivergent community regarding gambling prevention?
I guess if there's one thing they can do is just straying a little bit from the one size fits all approach they do with their media. For example, like a typical anti-gambling ad might initially show like the splendors of gambling, like people dressed in fancy suits or dresses and everybody having a good time. But for people like me, it's something that we don't really like. It's just worrying about like wearing the right clothes, like going to loud places, being around a bunch of strangers. Probably smells like cigarette smoke in there. Might find some people who are drunk. So when you're talking about a problem gambling with neurodivergence, their typical approaches to tackling these matters aren't going to hit exactly with the neurodivergent community. So that was what was so great about this opportunity. We were able to define problem gambling through our own eyes and our own experiences, and educate people in the neurodivergent community on what signs or symptoms to look for.
And Constance, any final thoughts?
Just my last share was to say that that neurodivergent is so unique and so many characteristics that vary per person. So there is no one size fit all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the takeaway, isn't it? That we live in a society where so many things cannot just be off the shelf. It has to be so like different for everybody else so that they actually get some true help of that. Penn, it's been great talking to you. Congratulations on The Odds. It's a beautifully laid out comic strip and obviously is available online. We'll be giving out the details after the interview. Constance as well, for your collaboration involved in this. To both of you, thank you ever so much. Continued success, and thank you for talking about The Odds and coming on and talking about neurodivergence here on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us, Brian.
And if you want to find out more about the comic strip called The Odds by Penn and Constance, you can find it at the-odds.weebly.com, where you can also find other resources about neurodivergency and gambling as well.
Brad Gazan, on Atlanta United, we know everyone has a ritual, a habit we never skip, to clear our minds and elevate our performance. But what do you do to keep your head in the game? Because being your best isn't just about taking care of your body, it's about taking care of your mind and mental health. Discover the resources you need to keep your mind focused and your mental health a priority.
Find resources at georgia.loveyourmindtoday.org. Brought to you by the Huntsman Mental Health Institute, the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, and the Ad Council.
Time now for a look at other stories making the headlines this week, supported by ctexaminer.com, reporting and supporting what matters. The non-profit watchdog organisation Leapfrog, that serves as a voice for healthcare consumers, released its fall 2025 Hospital Safety Grade Report recently. In it, Day Kimball Hospital, based in Putnam, and 3 Yale New Haven Health hospitals all dropped a grade since the spring Hospital Safety Grade Report this year. Day Kimball is set to join Yukon Health as it looks to acquire Waterbury and Bristol hospitals as well in a recent announcement. Day Kimball dropped from a C to a D grade, making it the only hospital in the state with that score. Among some of the identified issues were increased infections in patients after colon surgery and a lack of specially trained ICU doctors. The Leapfrog report grades hospitals on 5 areas to give them their score. Yale New Haven Health saw 3 of its hospitals downgraded from B to C grades. They were Bridgeport Hospital Milford Campus, Lawrence and Memorial Hospital in New London, and Yale's St. Raphael Campus in New Haven, with Bridgeport, Milford and St. Raphael reporting worse than average sepsis infections after surgery at their locations. Day Kimball said they were asking Leapfrog to reevaluate their D grade as it was not indicative of services and treatment the hospital was providing now. Yale New Haven Health said they disputed Leapfrog's findings, claiming data used was not up to date. In response, Leapfrog told Connecticut East This week they always use current data when it becomes available and had waited for that data because of the recent federal government shutdown. The Connecticut Audubon Society has released its annual State of the Birds report, highlighting progress but also continued challenges to the state's bird population. One of the main areas of concern is Connecticut's ospreys, says Milan Bull, co-founder of the State of the Birds report.
Populations of ospreys along the coast, are they doing better than our inland populations? In other words, are our saltwater-based, menhaden-based osprey populations doing better than our inland-based freshwater fish prey populations? This is what we need to understand.
Despite strong numbers of osprey in the state, Bull says those numbers are plateauing and that it's being reflected down in the Chesapeake Bay area, where the nation's largest osprey population live, where overfishing of their favorite food, menhaden fish, could be part of the problem. Bull says Congress must act to stop federal funding cuts for conservation and look to increase it instead.
Already in Connecticut, several of our national wildlife refuges are on offshore islands. We're having trouble even maintaining boats to get out to these islands to have them protected, monitored, and conserved.
The report also highlights the continued decline in the nation's bird population, which has lost 3 billion birds across the continent since 1970. Bull says if the government abandons funding and conservation, birds and the scientists that study them will both suffer. You can find the latest State of the Birds report at ctaudubon.org. Electric Boat, based in Groton, announced they have acquired the former Sears department store at the Crystal Mall shopping centre in Waterford. The submarine manufacturer now has the entire mall facility, which they intend to to redevelop for their administrative, training and laboratory departments to free up space at their main shipyard in Groton. EB made the announcement via a press release saying the acquisition of the third and final part of the Crystal Mall site is an important addition to their submarine production facilities. The company first purchased the former Macy's store at the mall in June for $6.5 million and in October announced it had purchased the rest of the Crystal Mall minus the Sears store for $25 million. EB intends to move around 4,000 to 5,000 employees into the Crystal Mall site sometime in 2027. The company did not disclose how much it had paid for the Sears store. Massachusetts is one of the nation's top producers of cranberries, but a growing number of cranberry farmers are converting their bogs back to natural wetlands. Catherine Carley from the Public News Service has this report.
Since 2020, more than 100 farmers have consolidated their operations or retired them altogether as prices for the traditional berries decline and climate change makes them harder to grow. Beth Lambert, director of the state's Division of Ecological Restoration, says it's a win-win for both biodiversity and the farmer.
That's why we call it a green exit strategy, because it results in natural wetlands that are restored for the benefit of the public. And then also it allows the farmer to receive some compensation from the process.
The state has awarded some $6 million for cranberry bog and coastal wetlands restoration. More than 500 acres of wetlands have already been revitalized. Lambert says the program is just one way cranberry farmers can ensure their land is conserved for future generations. I'm Catherine Carley.
And in the City Examiner this week, Francisco Uranga reports on why Eversource customers will pay more for their electricity this winter, despite the public benefit charge being cut, saying that customers of Connecticut's largest electric utilities will see higher bills starting January 1st. The increase will hit Eversource customers harder than those served by United Illuminating. Eversource customers will face a 10.5% increase in their bills compared to the current amount for a typical customer using around 700 kilowatt hours, according to calculations by the Office of Consumer Counsel. That translates into roughly $20 more per month. The driver of the increase is a 29% jump in the supply portion of the bill compared to last winter. Eversource customers will pay 13% more for supply rates, approximately $10 additional per month. The increase slightly exceeded the savings from reduced public benefit charges for Eversource customers. Since September 1st, those customers have saved an average of $9 per month after portions of those charges were removed from their bills and paid by the state. Public benefit charges represent the portion of bills tied to government-mandated programs, including power purchase agreements, such as the one with the Millstone Nuclear Power Plant, and assistance programs for customers facing financial hardship. Last summer, public benefit charges spiked sharply and sent bills soaring, starting a heated debate during the election campaign. And Amy Wu reports on Stonington's outgoing First Selectman Danielle Cheeseborough as she looks ahead to growing the Connecticut Forward Party that she is the chair of. In the 2023 election, Cheeseborough was a Forward Party candidate and has been actively involved in growing the third party along with other statewide Forward Party leaders, including Neil Chowdhury, who recently ran for Newtown's Police Commission. Cheeseborough plans to work on recruiting and training potential candidates for the municipal elections in 2 years. The Forward Party also endorsed Bill Middleton, who will be replacing Cheeseborough as Stonington's first selectman. Cheeseborough also aims to create a scorecard similar to the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, which grades elected representatives. She also has been working with the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, CCM, in starting citizen assemblies to invite more public participation in decision-making. Residents are connected through in-person forums that focus on hot-button topics. You can read both of those stories by visiting cityexaminer.com. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East and on Instagram at Connecticut East This Week. And you can listen to the show again on our social platforms, on demand, and by asking your smart speaker to play Connecticut East This Week podcast. And please like, follow, and share on your social media too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.